Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the Z mount 24-200 and we're going to be directly comparing that against the F mount 28-300. So this is a comparison that a lot of you have asked for, because I know there's a lot of photographers that have that 28-300 on their current cameras as a good kind of all-in-one travel lens. There's a lot of people out there that use that lens on a daily basis for all different types of photography. So there's a lot of you that are wondering if you could go to the 24-200, keeping it as a native lens. You don't need to use the adapter, a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, and you're wondering if the picture quality is going to be better as well throughout that zoom range. So that's the question that we're going to answer today. We're obviously going to look at different focal lengths and we'll look at different apertures as we normally do. So we're going to look at 28mm, 50mm, 120mm, and then 200mm as well. And this will be the first time that I've compared the 24-200 at 200mm. So for those of you that are interested in it at the longer focal lengths, this should hopefully be a video that's useful for you as well. That being said, I don't think that the main decision between the two lenses is actually going to come down to picture quality. There is a difference in picture quality, as you'll see, and we'll still talk about that. But actually the big difference is in focus breathing. It's quite well known that the 28-300 isn't particularly the best lens when it comes to focus breathing. And that can mean that actually when it's zoomed to 200mm, it doesn't actually give you the same field of view as 200mm. So what you'll find is that the 24-200 offers you more zoom at the same focal length in a smaller, lighter lens. So I'll show you some examples of that right at the end of the video. I've done a side-by-side comparison at the same focal length, at the same distance, and you can quite clearly see that the difference between the two lenses is night and day. So we'll take a look at that at the end of the video. But before we do that, we'll look at their picture quality. So that's what we'll go do now. As with all my tests, I always just want to show you what's right in front of you. I just want to show you the results that come straight out of the lenses and compare them side by side. I will talk about my thoughts and feelings and kind of what I see in front of me. If you agree with that, then that's great. If you disagree with it, then that's great too, because I just want you to be able to see what you can see in front of you, what's going to be more important to you and your photography. So take away from it whatever you can. Let's go take a look and see what we can see. We have the 24-200 on the left at 28mm, because obviously we're comparing against a 28-300. And because it's at 28mm, the lowest aperture it can go to is f4.2. And then on the right hand side, we have the 28-300, and that's at 28mm and at f4. It can go lower to obviously f3.5 at 28mm, but I thought I'd stop it down to f4, so it's very similar to that f4.2 that we have on the 24-200. So let's go take a look and see what we can see. So here we are at 1:1, and I think, you know, this is kind of what I expected. That 28-300 is a really good lens for its convenience, but it was never necessarily the best lens in terms of sharpness and contrast and detail. And even at 1:1, I think the 24-200 just looks a little bit more punchy, a little bit sharper, a little bit more contrast. The 28-300 still looks good, but it's just not as clear, not as contrasty, not as sharp as the 24-200 is on that left hand side. And if that's visible at 1:1, we'll obviously be able to see that straight away at 2:1. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. But moving around the frame, yeah, I mean, as soon as we move off center, there's a whole world of detail loss and poor resolution that is, they're two worlds apart. They're two completely different lenses. And the 28-300 is technically stopped down to f4 rather than being wide open at 3.5, so a little bit of extra sharpness would have come through there, but yeah, they are completely different lenses personally. As we move closer towards the edges, and the difference is night and day, quite clearly. So we'll take a look at 2:1, and we'll see what happens when we look a bit closer. So here we are at 2:1, and we can just see that extra sharpness and detail straight away, just a lot softer in the center of the frame. Wherever we look around the frame, just a lot softer, just less controlled, not as good resolution, contrast. Even the colors look to be a little bit washed out. This red definitely is a lot more pale than it is on the 24-200, and I mean that's a perfect example of the difference between these two lenses, to be honest. And then right over towards the edges of the frame, yeah, the level of sharpness difference is quite clear. So we'll stop the lenses down, see if that 28-300 sharpens up anymore. Here we are at 28mm f5.6, 24-200 on the left, 28-300 on the right. One of the things you'll notice as well is that the exposures are quite a bit different at f5.6. So to get the correct exposure, I had to use 1/6 of a second shutter speed for the 28-300, whereas with the 24-200, I used 1/10 of a second. It kind of gives us that information that the 24-200 at f5.6 is letting in more light than the other lenses are. So here we are at 1:1, and the 28-300 is definitely sharpened up somewhat, but it still just doesn't have that punch and clarity that the 24-200 has, I think. But we'll take a look at 2:1 and we should be able to see any smaller differences there. But across the frame, they look fairly similar. And again, I think at 1:1, this is where most people are going to be looking at their images. They look fairly similar now that that 28-300 is stopped down to f5.6. I do feel like there's still a lot more detail in here though. So here we are at 2:1, and we can see that difference in sharpness and detail, just a lot softer, just not as sharp really. Resolution is starting to struggle as well. It's just not, we're not getting the absolute best out of the camera. And obviously these are taken on a Z7, so higher megapixel count. Quite a bit of difference between these two, even though the 28-300 has been stopped down. Kind of expected though, because it's got that such a huge range to cover, it's always going to fall down somewhere. And that doesn't really tend to improve in the corners either, as you would expect. So that 28-300 is still quite soft in the corners. Here we are at 50mm and f5.6. So the 24-200 on the left and the 28-300 on the right. I've jumped straight in at 1:1 to see if we can see any differences. And at the center of the frame, they look very similar. There's not a massive noticeable difference between them really. Off center again, they look fairly similar as well. We're at f5.6 because obviously the 24-200 at 50mm can only go down to f5.6. Right over in the corners, that's where the 28-300 just gets softer. We can see the difference between them straight away, even at 1:1. So we know that even at 50mm, that 28-300 still isn't as sharp in the corners as the 24-200 is, even though it's technically stopped down to 5.6. So we'll take a look at 2:1, see what the difference looks like. So here we are at 2:1, and it's pretty close, but that 24-200 is still just sharper and more detailed than the 28-300 is at the center of the frame at 2:1. Smaller details are sharper, just produces a nicer image really. And then as we can still see over towards the edges of the frame, the 24-200 is still sharper than the 28-300 when at 50mm. Here we are, both lenses at 50mm and f8, 24-200 on the left, 28-300 on the right. And even at f8, I've come in straight away here at 2:1. There's not a massive difference at 1:1, so hopefully you don't mind that. But even here at f8 at 2:1, at 28-300 never really sharpens up to match the 24-200. As I mentioned, just an older lens. I just think it's not being able to resolve the amount of detail that the newer Z series lens can. And this is obviously going to be more impactful if you have a higher megapixel camera, so D850, Z7, more impactful than it would be on a Z6, for example. Really clear differences here between the level of detail, resolution and sharpness that you can see between the two lenses. And remember, both of them are f8 here, so again here the 24-200 just outshines the 28-300 in terms of detail, and that remains to be the same case even right towards the edges of the frame. Okay, so we're going to change focal length, see what happens then. Right, so here we are now at 120mm, and this is where things start to get a little bit interesting, because the 28-300mm lens starts to be affected quite badly by focus breathing, and that'll become more apparent when we look at 200mm as well. let's go take a look at 120mm. Both lenses are f6.3. So here we are first of all at 1:1, and the images are very similar in terms of sharpness and detail. Not really a noticeable difference between them at 1:1. In the corners of the frame, as we've come to expect, that 24-200 is still sharper, giving us that better sharpness across the frame because it's making use of the Z mount rather than being the F mount. So here we are at 2:1, and they're similar at the middle of the frame. One thing we can quite clearly see is that the 24-200 is actually more zoomed in than the 28-300 is, as I mentioned, because of that focus breathing going on. Its focal length of 120mm isn't actually the same. Moving towards the edges of the frame, we can see that the 24-200 is still significantly sharper than the 28-300 at the middle of the frame. Okay, so here we are at 120mm, but now we're stopped down to f8. Again, 24-200 on the left and 28-300 on the right. So as we've come to expect here, there's not a massive difference when both lenses are stopped down at 1:1. Even if we kind of move towards the edges of the frame, there's not a massive difference. Maybe a bit of sharpness loss here, just not as sharp on the 28-300 in the corners as we've seen from previous examples. So what we'll do is we'll jump to 2:1 and we'll have a look at 2:1, see if we can see any differences. So here we are at 2:1, and the 24-200 is still sharper at the center of the frame. It's not a massive difference, but we can see that it is sharper at the center of the frame. And let's have a look as we move towards the edges. So again here we can just see that we're getting more detail, and I think just a higher resolution from that 24-200 compared to the 28-300 as we've talked about. And then right over to the edges of the frame, we can see not only how much bigger in the frame the camera is because of the different focal lengths caused by the focus breathing, but also how much sharper we are towards the corners of the frame as well in that 24-200 versus the 28-300. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump to 200mm now, and we're going to compare them side by side, and that's going to be really interesting to see, to be honest. Okay, so here we are at 200mm, the 24-200 on the left and the 28-300 on the right. And first of all, one of the biggest things you should see straight away is the difference in focal length. Now, they are both at 200mm, but they aren't giving you the same field of view because that 28-300 focus breathes. That means that its focal length changes depending on where the camera is focused. And that means that it's actually a much wider field of view at 200mm compared to the 24-200. And so I've not changed anything here. Obviously what I've done is I've swapped the lenses around, the camera's stayed in the same place, and we can see it makes quite a huge difference on both sides of the frame. If we compare here, and also this entire lens on the left hand side of the frame is completely removed on the 24-200 shot, so do keep that in mind. Both lenses are here at f6.3. Go take a look, see if there's any differences in picture quality. So at 1:1, they look fairly similar. I'm going to say that actually probably a little bit more sharpness and detail in the 24-200. As we start to move around the frame, we can see that they hold up fairly well, and we can also see quite a big difference here in the size of the frame. Even if let's see if I can line them up. That really shows there the difference. Both of these lenses are at 200mm. In terms of sharpness and detail, they look similar. Obviously a little bit more detail on that 24-200 on the left. And again, right towards the edges of the frame, just a little bit more sharpness on that 24-200 than there is on the 28-300. So we'll have a quick look at 2:1, see what that looks like. So here we are at 2:1. And even though the 24-200 is a lot more zoomed in, it's still sharper, retains more detail than the 28-300 does. And I think we're just losing the sharpness, and we're starting to lose some of that resolution as well. Just all round, just a better lens really at 200mm. And considering that this is at the full extent of that 24-200 and it's still performing really, really well. It's not like it gets worse as it gets longer, for example. It performs quite nicely at that 200 focal length. And again, just a lot more detail, sharpness, higher resolution. We can just really see a lot more information in this shot than we can do on the 28-300. I'm going to do one last one where I'm going to stop both the lenses down to f8. Okay, so here we are at 200mm at f8, 24 to 200 on the left and 28 to 300 on the right. 24 to 200 does just look sharper, it has a nice pop to it, a little bit more contrasty. The 28 to 300 is obviously suffering from not quite having the same field of view at 200mm, so subject isn't quite as large in the frame. But it has sharpened up from f8 versus where it was at 6.3. At 1:1 we can see that it's just not as detailed. It still looks nice and sharp though. It's doing a fairly good job. So when we look at 2:1, it's quite clear. It's quite clear that the 28 to 300 is just not as sharp, not as detailed at 200mm, and we're kind of getting the maximum picture quality out of that 24 to 200 instead. So when we're looking at this area here again, that 28 to 300 has sharpened up because now it's gone to f8 compared to what we were looking at f6.3, but it's still just not sharp, just not as sharp or just not as detailed as that 24 to 200 is, unfortunately. Well, I hope that you found this video useful, and I hope it's given you some insight in the differences between the new 24-200 and that older 28-300. If you have any questions, then please do pop them below. The next video in this series will be either the VR test, so I want to do a VR test between the 24-200 and the 24-70 f4, or it'll be the video where I'm comparing the 24-200 against the 24-120. Just depends on which one I can get finished, edited and done first. So keep an eye out for those videos. There's more videos about this 24-200 coming up. There's still a lot more that I want to test with this. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.